Welcome to Fashion Climate Conversations. I'm your host, Louis Perkins. Fashion is an art form like any other: music, painting, theater, or film. It's a way in which we share our identities, cultures, and beliefs. It's a way we can creatively tell our stories, who we are, what we want others to know about us, or the communities we claim. And we can even use it to confront, challenge, and drive change in our world. And yet oftentimes the way we make our clothes has a negative impact on people and planet. But we're changing that. This podcast series features conversations with people who are working in science, technology, and innovations, such as next generation materials and clean energy. Yes, definitely clean energy, in order to solve for one of the largest global issues today, the climate crisis. And fashion is playing a leadership role. So thank you for joining this podcast series to listen and learn along with me and the many guests that we'll have from the industry, all working on solutions for climate and other impacts to make fashion a positive force in the world. Hey, Michael, how are you?
Hey, Louis, I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for joining me. This is the first episode of our new season of podcast conversations, curious conversations. I was calling them last year, but as you know, we really feel strongly that the conversation for climate and climate action in the apparel sector is critically important today. So we're going to focus this series of conversations this year on fashion climate solutions or fashion climate conversations. So you're our first guest. Thank you.
Fantastic. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you're here. So, as I'm thinking about, first of all, Michael, I know you well and have known you increasingly well over the last year and a half or so as we've been working on the roadmap report together. But tell people who you are and how you got into this work.
Yeah, sure. So, I think, Louis, you and I maybe have known each other for, like 7 years. I remember meeting you back in like 2014. You were at Cradle to Cradle. I was at Nike, and there was a session around textile recycling that you convened. And we were in the room with a bunch of chemical recyclers, which was fantastic. And that work continues. But obviously, we've worked pretty closely over the past couple of years on the roadmap, which we'll talk about. But I wear a few different hats. So I guess my title on your banner says that I'm the acting executive director of the Circulate initiative, which is a part-time gig where I'm leading an effort to address ocean plastic by investing in the circular economy in South and Southeast Asia, which happens to be where a lot of manufacturers of apparel are based. So there's some relevance there. I'm a freelance consultant to a number of apparel and other brands. I work with a number of industry associations in the apparel sector, so Textile Exchange and Outdoor Industry Association and the SAC. And then relevant to this conversation, I've been a research consultant to World Resources Institute for the past 4 years, working on all things apparel and climate related. I've worked in sustainability for about 20 years across sectors, and I think we'll get into this, how, a lot of what the apparel sector is dealing with, I think, is relevant to other sectors as well.
That's great. Yes, you do have a very rich, even as I'm hearing you describe it, just thinking about all the angles of expertise within sustainability and textile apparel footwear that you've acquired over the years. You're a logical, strong partner and asset for us as we've been doing this work. And I also do remember meeting you, if it's the same event, I remember meeting you at one that was in San Francisco, but you may be because we convene a number of those events. And I remember starting to get to know you through the circular economy work and Ellen MacArthur Foundation and bringing Nike into some conversations around what we were doing with materials at Cradle to Cradle.
Exactly.
And then we re-met again in Spain to do a workshop. I think we talked beforehand, but we're coming up on 3 years ago when we convened at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition meeting in Spain, and we led a workshop on sort of envisioning this roadmap, taking the guidelines that you'd been working on with World Resources Institute. Tell us a little bit about like that initial framework with WRI and how that kind of emerged into this work for the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think about those days when we could travel for work, and it was great to be in Barcelona.
Yeah.
That was the launch of the apparel sector guidance for science-based targets that WRI and the Science Based Targets Initiative published. So that was June of 2019, and that guidance was really meant to help apparel companies set targets, because at the time there wasn't great consistency and alignment with how apparel companies were addressing climate in their corporate targets. And so that guidance was meant to bring that consistency and really get more companies to set science-based targets. We used that occasion with you and team to convene that workshop to really start fleshing out really the beginnings of the roadmap. So we know, what companies need to do. So reducing emissions by roughly half by 2030. The focus of that workshop was starting to dig into like, how can we collectively do this? So we know where we need to go. What are the steps? And so that meeting was really the origin of the SBT roadmap, which we'll talk about. And it really brought together brands, manufacturers, NGOs, other stakeholders to just share their collective knowledge about how to do that.
Yeah, when you talk about sort of missing the convening in person, that was a great day because we did have some pretty significant folks in the room
Yeah,
that we have been partners for the last 3 years working on this work, from
exactly.
UNFCCC to WWF, like you mentioned, a number of brands, obviously, because they
Yeah,
were convened for the SAC meeting.
exactly.
And I'll say for us, and I know you know this, our framework as an organization has really been highly influenced by that framework and the
Yeah,
subsequent report, because we've been looking at, and I think even we've been looking at, how can we best help the industry achieve those targets by scaling specific impact solutions, some of which we know and are
yeah,
scale ready, and some of which we don't know, and there's an innovation gap. So
yeah,
the next thing was, let's dig in and do a report. Let's do some R&D and put together a report based on that workshop.
yes.
How did you go about? And by the way, we'll put the link to the report in, because we're going to reference that and the Unlocking 1 Trillion
Yeah,
report as we talk. How did you go about sort of putting together the beginning stage of that work? And I know Emily McGarvey on our
yep.
team was working with you as well. And yeah, how did it get started?
Yes, I mean, the roadmap to net zero was a collaboration between AII and WRI. And so, long story short, we did a whole bunch of desk research. As you know, and your readers or watchers may know, quite a few entities have put out estimates of the emissions of the apparel sector, have put out how to reduce emissions. Our goal was to try to bring all of that together in one place. So we conducted a lot of desk research. We spoke to dozens of industry experts at brands and manufacturers, technical experts, consultants, to really understand what are those main levers that can reduce emissions. We worked with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition in Hague to develop a new estimate of sector greenhouse gas emissions, which we can come back and talk about, and really use that as our basis to say, if business as usual continues, what will emissions look like? And then, what are the key interventions that we need to make to drive emissions? So we took all of that, the research, the interviews, the analysis from the SAC and HIG. We had several rounds of vetting with experts, and WRI has a fairly rigorous process to do that. And that's really what resulted in the roadmap. It was to be candid, it was a bit of a lengthy process. It took 2 years, and I know our collective teams, got a little impatient waiting for those.
We're
For the
still
report.
friends,
We're
right?
still friends, but there was just a lot of stakeholder input that went into it. We're super appreciative of Loudest Foundation, which funded the report, and all of the stakeholders that gave us their time and expertise. And so, yeah, that all culminated into the launch of the report a few months ago. And yeah, we're pretty excited that's out there.
Yeah. So, if I'm someone that's not if I'm not a big brand retailer who's pretty steeped in this work and has been
Yeah,
looking at my focus areas, or we're calling them the levers, but these are kind of the buckets of where the work needs to
yeah.
happen, which we can talk through. Like, what is this report? Why is this report being out in the world good? What is it telling me? How should I look at using this report? what benefit is it, in your opinion?
Yes, I mean, I think there are a couple of ways that it would benefit such a reader. I think it distills um, the various recommendations that different groups have made about how to reduce emissions in the sector down to 6. So we've kind of given this short menu for if we are trying to drive towards net zero by 2050 with this, 45% by 2030 interim step, we know what to do, right? These are the 6 things that we have to do. Generally speaking, they're going to be the same for every company. There may be some differences based on the type of product a company makes, but generally speaking, we know what to do. We've also called out some of the main barriers to delivering each of these and how to overcome those. And I think that's really important to just kind of put that in writing and put it in one place so people can see how can we do this. And then I think importantly, we leveraged what we believe the best data set that there is, which is the Higg MSI and textile exchange fiber volume data to come up with this new estimate with the goal that we improve this over time. That and again, we can dig into this, but we know that the apparel sector is just is lacking high quality data, and groups like Higg and the SAC are working to improve that. But for us, this was a first opportunity to share this new estimate, and the intent is to improve this over time.
Yep,
So.
and the estimates also in alignment with other reports that have had similar. It's not a complete departure.
It's not a complete departure, and I think
Yeah.
what's important to say about all of the estimates, including ours, is that they're imperfect, and they're the way I speak of ours is like it's the best estimate that we think we can put out today. But I wouldn't hang my hat and bet on that number being the number. We have to make.
Yeah.
We have to do things to improve the underlying data. For example, getting more direct greenhouse gas data from factories, from material suppliers, and use less secondary data, which we can talk about. So I think that's really important. And I think also important, like we also generally know where the emissions sit within the value chain. So for example, tier 2, textile processing, so knitting, weaving, dyeing, and finishing accounts for roughly half of sector emissions. And so I think it's really important to point the industry and potential collaborators, investors, funders to say half of the emissions sit in textile mills. Let's not spin our wheels on packaging, certain legs of logistics, other things. Those things have to be addressed to get to net zero, don't get me wrong, but like there's a massive chunk of emissions that needs to come out in textile mills. And if we can solve that, there's going to be ripple effects across this sector and others. So,
yeah, I love that, Michael, because I think that it is, you need to be doing a little bit of everything, right? You need to have a strategy around all, but there are certainly areas in which these reports, and our report in particular, do identify and point you towards key interventions that have to happen immediately. And you just pointed out the big one, which we've known for a while, and our program Clean by Design was really on the cornerstone of this, which is that mill efficiency is one of the key areas in which you can lower carbon before you even disrupt the use of the boilers. You can start to become more efficient with the thermal heat being used. And then from there, it's this exploration of, well, how do we continue to remove carbon in that process in an industry that is still predominantly using the cheapest form of energy for thermal heat, which is coal. So that's like right there. And I think 50%, roughly, give or take, let's start there. And I like that as terms of, as you put it out, it's like, not only is that a great way to direct manufacturers and potentially the brands that are sourcing from them as to where we should focus our recruitment energy, it's also the investment opportunity, which is if you're a climate funder and you're looking to fund programs and projects which are going to remove carbon, that is like a primary area, not only for what it already exists, but then also where there's a gap for innovation.
Exactly. And as I mentioned, if you can solve for coal used for thermal energy in apparel, you could then deploy that to other sectors, right? So that's a that's an issue that lots of smart folks are working on. For example, how do you make steel and cement and other high carbon intensive
Glass and
products, all of
ceramics,
these
and
things
yeah, yeah,
without coal? Those are really big challenges to solve. But I think apparel doesn't need that same high heat level. But still, if you can crack it for apparel, you can probably transfer that to some other similar sectors, whether it's electronics or other places. But there's some solutions some of the interventions that I think are kind of ready to go, so companies can adopt these things today. And there's some other things that you alluded to, I think will take some more R&D and time and investment to make work.
yeah. That's great. The report is really organized around these levers too.
Yep.
And go ahead and just rattle them off. I'm sure you want.
Yeah, so there were six, as I mentioned. So one was maximizing material efficiency. So for every garment made, let's make sure that there's as little material wasted that goes into that garment, right? So there's less need for raw materials grown per garment, if you will. There are sustainable materials that we know, for example, recycled polyester, organic cotton, recycled cotton, various forms of better man-made cellulosics. Like these things are available, they're being used. Like we've got to turn the dial up massively on those and get brands using them. We also know the challenges to some of those things. Like for example, the recycled polyester market is really tight. Lots of industries want recycled PET. Beverage companies have made targets, so we've got to figure out how to dramatically increase recycling and just get more supply. And we've got to solve textile recycling, which kind of brings me to this third point of innovative materials, or what we call them, next-gen materials. So
Next gen.
the apparel sector needs to figure out, and there are plenty of companies working on this, and it seems like we're just getting so close to doing this at scale. But can we take a t-shirt, put it into a machine, spit out yarn on the other side or fiber on the other side? This is coming, and we've got to accelerate that. We need brands to work with these technologies to pull them through faster, commit to the output. And so we need to do that across material types, whether it's leather or rubber or textiles. Maximizing energy efficiency should be kind of a no-brainer for manufacturers. And you can speak to your programs, IAI's programs in this space, but there's money to be saved, right, by increasing efficiency in a factory, right? And so we've got to dial that up, because that really should be the first step before you start thinking about replacing boilers and switching to renewables, because you don't want to pay for wasted energy, right? So energy efficiency, addressing the thermal energy issue, and that's really coal in manufacturing. So coal, just happens to be a quote unquote good fuel because it's got high heat value and it's cheap and it's plentiful in many places. And, there are kind of forces behind why we keep using this, right? So we've got to figure out a way to shift away from coal. And this is a challenge, right? This is an R&D challenge. It's a systems challenge. Not every country has coal. Gas is some people call it a bridge, but still, it's carbon intensive. So other solutions like concentrated solar, biomass, depending on the source, come into play. And then lastly, this shift to renewable energy. So ultimately, we've got to deploy renewables at scale across the value chain. And so there's been some great work in the apparel sector in places like Vietnam to really try to do that in a big way. And then there's some other great work happening by groups like the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator that are working to deploy solar on rooftops. And so there's just a lot of great momentum in the sector, and we need to keep that and just kind of continue to turn up the dial, because we don't have much time. Yeah.
And then you mentioned, or maybe you didn't mention, but you have a background in circularity. You're working on circularity. That was an area to circular business models and solutions in the in the supply chain, not post-consumer. That was part of a consideration. Tell us a little bit about that and why it didn't ultimately make it to be, a big part of the report.
Yeah, well, it's not one of the 6 levers, because it's really difficult to model the greenhouse gas benefits of circular business models. So we do have a brief section in the report on circularity. And as you know, there are quite a few companies that have started up in this space that are working with brands and retailers to, do things like resale and rental and repair. And we should applaud those, and we should encourage many more of them to grow. But I think the big question, certainly from the WRI side, has been, how do you actually count the emissions savings from those models? So if I buy a used shirt on a platform like a Poshmark or a ThredUp, does that mean I don't go out and buy another brand new T-shirt, right? So I think that the critical question, not to get too wonky in this conversation, is this so-called displacement rate. So really, circular models will reduce emissions when consumption goes down, right? And so that's really the question. And again, as you know, like lots of brands are thinking about how can they keep growing, right? Growing revenue while decoupling their production of stuff, right? And I think just about every brand, every good-sized brand I know is dabbling with rental, repair, resale, subscription. So there's a lot of good thinking going on in that space.
Yeah, yeah, and actually embedded in the three material levers is circularity as well too,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
next generation raw material inputs are going to be recycled content.
Correct.
There's going to be, there's going to be links to other industries like agricultural waste to become new fibers that go in. So when we talk about the scope 3 emissions or tier 4, particularly raw materials, I think that circularity does show up in all of those.
Absolutely. And I think you have companies that are doing that today, and maybe they're not calling it circular, but it's like it just makes good business sense to pick up the scrap off the floor and incorporate it back into the input side. So I think that's happening in denim mills and other places.
Absolutely.
And it just makes good business sense.
Absolutely. Yep. So how have you heard response to this report from the industry or other partners? What feedback are you getting?
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten a lot of great feedback from brands, manufacturers. There have been some really great media coverage of the report. We were really pleased, obviously, that you all used it for your finance report, and also that, I think just the key messages that we put out in the report, for example, around the need for improving data, are kind of coming out, right? So I think that is good for us to see, that people are really taking to heart that the fact that we know what to do. We've got to improve the data, and we're not going to wait until that data gets perfect, because we'll be waiting for quite a long time. So we've got to really act on those 6 things. And we spent a lot of time talking with folks before we published this, and we got some really good critical feedback on things, and we tried to reflect that in the report. So yeah, we feel really good about how people have responded, and not to reveal anything, but obviously you and I are thinking about a webinar series, which we'll put out.
That's right.
Some more news about soon. So we'll be able to get it out there to a broader audience, and I think really digging into like what can we collectively do to drive those interventions.
That's right. And I think the opportunity to have those with other stakeholders at the table from other organizations focusing on raw materials like Textile Exchange or data like SAC and obviously, sort of the brands that are doing this work. So I'm excited about building that webinar series with you as well. Thanks for the preliminary plug.
Yeah.
So I want to reiterate one thing that you said, and then I just want to ask your opinions on how this is all doing, because this is kind of this is a curious conversation series, so you can have opinions as opposed to facts, right? But what I want to reiterate is that you said basically this report is giving us the indication of where to go, and we can't really sit around and squabble over whether it's 2% or 3% or 4%, or that roughly we have what we knew, and we've organized in a way that takes the best data that's available and put it into sort of a systematic approach that the industry can take. And I think that's an important thing to just kind of reiterate, which is we could do this report over and improve that data over, multiple milestones or years. And that's great, but it won't change what it's telling us in terms of what to do. It may help drive towards new innovation to fill in some of the white space where the report alludes to certain areas, but we don't yet have those programs or
Correct.
pilots in place. Yeah.
Correct. Yep,
Yeah.
exactly. And, over time, there'll be more data on more materials, more facilities. So I think even since we published the report, or certainly since we were kind of near the end, like I think BCI came out with their emissions factor for their material, which we didn't know going into the report. There'll be, I think there are a few more leather data points in the MSI. So as, and this is really what the Hague Index is set up to do, right? Is to get better over time and for people to submit the best data they have. And then through the FEM, the Facilities Environmental Module, for facilities to be able to input their data so that, you've got one factory's data that many brands can engage with and extract from. And again, like we work in this sector, we all know that all of this data needs to be improved, but I think that's the best platform to do it.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say on that is that you also alluded to the report that we wrote based on the framework.
Yeah.
So you've helped us look at how do we take this to capital markets, and potentially philanthropic markets as well, and say, this is what kind of funding we need at which stage across these 6 areas. And this is what exists currently that's scale ready and the type of capital it will take from a blended capital approach. And at what stage, and then where there's an innovation gap. And I've mentioned that a couple of times because there are, and I think we're excited because AII is using this report to get in front of the types of organizations that can help close that innovation gap. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think for across the levers, again, as you've written in your report, like there might be different types of financing that's needed. And the hope is that this allows financiers to see this as an opportunity to say, we could create a loan fund for energy efficiency in Vietnam to support manufacturers that may not have the upfront capital to invest in more efficient knitting machines, but we've got a loan fund that could help support that. Or maybe there's a philanthropic organization that says, hey, we can see that dialing up recycled poly would be a massive benefit to emissions in the sector. Let's figure out how we might, like support companies to do this, but who knows, like maybe cover that premium. I don't know. There need to be some creative ways to think about this.
That's right. That's right. Good. Okay. So your opinion, what do you think, first of all, how do you think the industry is doing as a whole? I think that's always the elephant in the room. You and I get asked that all the time when we're on panels.
Yeah.
How's the industry doing?
So when we started the guidance, 4 years ago now, I think there were about 10 to 12 companies that had approved science-based targets or commitments to set them. We're fast approaching 200. And so the guidance has certainly helped that. I think the guidance plus the roadmap, as well as other entities that are working in the apparel sector, whether it's the UN, Fashion Industry Charter, Textile Exchange, like there's just a lot of conversation about climate change targets and aligning them with science. And so I think that, in my opinion, and I've worked across sectors over the years, I think the apparel sector is more collaborative than most that I know. And I think, we generally know, they generally know what we've got to do. And, this stuff is hard. And so like just this morning, I was reading a bit more about this potential regulation in New York State about the fashion industry and kind of pressing for greater transparency and data. And like, that's exactly the right work we've got to do. But it's not easy. And so I think that, I think through tools like the Hague, the industry is building a really good data set for what the impacts look like across topics. And, like pick a good sized company and go online. And I think you can read the good work that they're doing and working collectively to do things like pushing for renewable energy in Vietnam, sourcing recycled polyester, investing in things like regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of really good work to be done. And, the hope with the data component of the roadmap is to be able to eventually use that to track how the industry is collectively doing over time. So the better data we get, the better we'll be able to fine tune that.
Yeah, so. I like that. That was going to lead up to my next question. Do you think we should come back and do this report again at certain
Yeah,
milestones over the next 8 years to 2030?
I do. And it could be like an annual refresh. So we do a quick refresh with the SAC and Hague just to, again, I don't think the data is not going to get, perfect in the next year, right? There's still going to be issues next year. We're still going to be using secondary data like the MSI. But I think over time, how can we maybe start to bring in some of the Hague FEM data that covers tier 1 finished goods and tier 2 textile manufacturing? So swap out some of the MSI data that we use and bring in this data from the FEM. And so I think that would allow us to just, keep track, see how the data is trending, but also look for additional ways to make it better. So, and also to give updated direction to companies to say, hey, we did this report again. Now we've got more data on next gen materials, right? Like next year by this time, there could be, plant-based leathers in the MSI, and we can point that out.
Well, I like the idea that it could drive potential academic institutions or research laboratories or, or X Prize. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity to call out, this is a focused area the industry needs. And that's where, that's where we could potentially flesh out some new innovation. And that's, I think that's kind of exciting, particularly if we partnered with different, like I said, different types of institutions that are in the business of accelerating solutions or incubating solutions. And, so if I'm just an average citizen consumer who, is just likes clothes and wandered onto this because I thought it was about fashion, how is this relevant? This was a very detailed podcast. How is this relevant to me, average American, average European, or world citizen?
Man, I would love for this to resonate with the average citizen. I'm not sure we're there yet. I kind of use this Thanksgiving test where I go back home and talk to extended family and friends and try to engage them on sustainability. And I don't know about you, but the percentage of people that are tracking what we're doing on a daily basis isn't super high. And so I think that this report is more relevant for folks that work at apparel brands, folks that engage with and support apparel brands. I think it's really useful for policymakers, investors. And then I think this report over time contributes to efforts such as the SAC Hague trying to come up with a consumer-facing label that's based on sound data. And so ultimately, as this gets better, people have talked for a long time about this consumer-facing label, and lots of companies have tried to put carbon labels on products. That's a subject for a longer discussion between us. But I think this work that we're doing supports that over time, that it could feed that and better inform it. So
yeah, absolutely. Because for us, what will be tracked is every single project and program is going to have a carbon reduction impact report that needs to be then translated into how we're tracking this against Science-Based Targets Initiative and how we're allocating it to brands and et cetera. So behind this is a whole tremendous amount of data that will be improving and capturing. Any final call to action or thoughts that you have for anyone listening, depending on who they are, what audience they represent?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, we obviously focused our work on the apparel sector and laid out how can the sector get to 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That is the global goal, right? That's every sector, every aspect of the global economy has to do that. So whether you're automotive or food or transport, that's what we have to do. And it's a massive, massive undertaking. And we don't have a lot of time, right? So I think we've got 9 years of carbon budget left if we keep emitting the way we're emitting, to stay within 1.5 degrees C. And, we've known this has been coming for a while. So I think, like you, have worked in the field for a while, and you've just it's been gosh, another year goes by and we just have less and less time. We know what to do. And I think this report just puts very succinctly, these are the things, these are the 6 things. Don't worry about the data quality. We know enough about it to say, let's just start getting after recycled materials, getting out of coal. Let's really bring together the collective attention and investment of the industry. And again, the apparel sector has been great in terms of the collaboration, but what we need is, brands coming together to say, we're going to work to bring better materials to market. We're going to work to phase out coal, because it's, I don't care how big you are as a brand in the apparel space, whether you are a Gap or a Nike or a Walmart, like, you're still not big enough to change, the market for thermal coal in Vietnam. And so you need this collective attention. And again, like your group, AII, SAC, Fashion Charter, like, this is why those efforts are so critically important. So I just think we need to push hard and, really, I would say hold brands' feet to the fire in this regard, and just like, we know what to do. Let's just go do it. So
I like it. We know what to do. Just go do it.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it.
Cool.
All right, Michael. Well, thank you for your time today. I'm sure we'll have a million more conversations with you on podcasts and webinars, as we've talked about. So thank you again for the great work and the leadership.
And thank you for your work on the report, and for having me.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thanks, Liz. Bye.